that weren't Christian was very heavily really about not allowing prisoners to gather who were Muslim, particularly black Muslims converting inside prison. So you see all these ties, right? That the same kind of discourse. I once saw this post on a group of prison guards, and they were like, oh, the shoe is all radicalized. Like, there's all these Muslims. You have to be careful. The shoe is like the super max, where you get sent, like, allegedly if you kill someone in prison or something, but also if you're unmanageable in a disciplinary context. So I don't know if we have more to say on that.
Well, I just think it's funny how it's our prison system who's determining who goes into the supermax, and then is also at the same time reinforcing this idea that, oh, that's the radical, crazy place that you don't want to go, that you don't want to work there. That's where all of the really bad ones go. I mean, it's the system that is selecting people that it's putting into the most punitive situations. I had the fortune of interviewing a fellow named Ibrahim Toure 3-4 weeks ago now on my radio station in Toronto. Ibrahim Toure is, at this time, the longest-serving immigration detainee in this country. He has been in maximum security jail, mostly in Lindsay, Ontario, for over 4.5 years. The reason our government says that it has kept Ibrahim Toure in this maximum security facility for 4.5 years is not because of a crime that he's committed or been charged with or been convicted of, but because his immigration is unsolved and the government believes that he would be a so-called flight risk if he was not kept in prison. And so for the cost of $250 a day, table that up in your mind and think about a week's worth of that money or a month's worth of that money and what that money could do to help individuals in this country or to support a better immigration system. But instead, that $250 a day is being used to keep Ibrahim Toure in a maximum security jail, even though he has not been convicted of a crime in Canada, for 4.5+ years now. I went to the hearing, the federal hearing that he had recently, where they were going to decide if 4.5 years has been enough. And the judge at that time decided that it's not enough and that he sent Ibrahim Toure back. So this is everybody in this room. This is how the government is spending your money. And when it tells you that it doesn't have money for social needs, that it doesn't have money for housing, that it doesn't have money to improve our immigration system or to support people who are in poverty, this is the reason why. Because the punitive costs so grossly outweigh what we are spending to help people, but they are the government's priority.
I was going to say as well, in the Valley, Deborah Spencer, who is still under deportation order. She has 4 children in Canada. She was born in the Caribbean, came to foster care here, experienced extreme abuse in Canada, was criminalized, and then after she served her sentence was placed under deportation order, which she is still under. And I also want to raise that because particularly around this idea of respectable speech and criminalization of women, I do want to raise that as well, because it ties into some of these issues, that particularly when women of color, the prison system becomes a disciplining into like the appropriate gender. So I just came back from the maximum unit at Nova. I work with the woman there.
That's in Cape Breton, yeah?
This was in Truro.
Sorry.
Cape Breton, there's a story in Cape Breton. So yes, I actually came back from Cape Breton, and speaking of deportation orders, Fliss Crammon, if you remember, who was in the news a year ago, where they had chained her to a bed. So she, again, another kid in foster care, you're gonna notice a pattern here because our government does not seek the papers for kids under their care. So you have kids that are in care, removed from their parents. The state doesn't step in and get them their papers. So through the foster care system, the abuse they experience are extremely vulnerable to criminalization. And then they get criminalized. Over 6 months of prison, you can be deported in this country. So Fliss Crammon sold to an undercover drugs she did not have. They were imaginary drugs. She's poor. She has a lot of mental illness issues. She said something on Facebook like, oh, I could use some drugs. And an undercover entrapped her. Her lawyer dealt for 2.5 years because he thought you'll get help in prison because, oh, you have addictions and there's no treatment for you on the outside, so which is just, right? Not even thinking about whether she could be deported. She serves her time. When she gets out, they take her straight back to detention, which is jail. She's so ill, her stomach was perforated, they had to take her to the hospital, she collapsed, and they chained her to her bed after having major abdominal surgery. So it was mostly the Elizabeth Fry advocates who were doing this work, but Women's Illness and myself, we did a protest to, have her unchained, because these are the things you have to protest in Canada. Like, can we not chain this woman to a bed? The Justice Minister, of course, acted shocked and the Premier that this was happening, but I know women who have given birth in shackles in Nova Scotia. So certainly pregnant women are also chained. Anyway, she came to Cape Breton. I was speaking there, And she showed up at this talk. And this is, again, a woman that still does not have status. She's still in the first phase of getting her immigration, and she brought me presents. And she was saying, you know, I just want to meet the woman who came and helped me because we were outside her hospital bed. And I remember that rally because they strategically unchained her at noon when we were holding a rally at 5. So a lot of people didn't come because they're like, mission accomplished. But we were like, we still need to be there for Bliss. She's still under the deportation order. And I'm telling the story in a long way because Ashley Smith's family came. And this is, of course, the 10-year anniversary of Ashley Smith's death. They just held the ceremonies yesterday in St. John's. None of those recommendations have been implemented. And I remember standing there with Ashley Smith's mother and sister, and I was freaking out. I'm like, no one's going to come. It's like 5 minutes. We're going to look stupid. All the news is here. There's like 3 people. And her sister turned to me and she said, Elle, there's 3 people here. That's more than most women in prison have. That's 3 more than most women in prison have. So is that woman, and I was telling you how she came, and it was such a beautiful moment. But we're raising these issues because I think also to talk about how this criminalization of women moves outwards, right? So Ashley Smith was criminalized for stuff like rolling her eyes. They said that she was violent. The only 2 instances anyone can find is she snatched glasses off the staff's head to harm herself with. But she constantly had this record of violence because she did not behave in the ways that women respectfully and decorously were supposed to behave. So.
I mean, I also want to rap a little bit about Beverly Brom, whose story in our city in Toronto has been in the news for the better part of this year. Earlier this year, Beverly, who is originally from Jamaica, was in the news because she was pregnant. She was around 31 weeks pregnant back in the late winter, early spring of this year. And at that time, the Canadian Border Services Agency said, we are going to deport you. This woman has medical conditions. Her doctor said she was not well enough to fly, and she was 31 weeks pregnant. So I want you to try and imagine the mind state of a mom who's in that part of her pregnancy and what she's thinking about and the stress that she's undergoing, trying to imagine that she is going to be separated from her partner, who is a Canadian citizen, by the way, who lives in Toronto, or in the Toronto area, I should say, in Brampton. And she's imagining that she's going to be separated from him and has to have a baby without him, even though they are a family. Just that stress alone, that's what we talk about when we say that the damage of these things is done, but we have to fight to stop that deportation order, to tell people who are responsible for life in this country that they shouldn't put a distressed 31-week pregnant, woman on an airplane. These are not the fights that we should be having, but we spent great capacity sending hundreds of messages to the Public Safety Minister, Ralph Goodale, to stop that deportation order, and we did. However, this fall, this September, we had to go back out into the streets because Beverly had her baby, and in his infancy, he and Beverly were apprehended by Canadian Border Services Agency and put in a cell for 2 days. They put a woman with a baby, with a nursing age baby, inside of a detention center for 48 hours and then released them. So we see the game because that's about intimidation. It's not about enforcement. It's not about keeping anyone safe from anyone. Otherwise, you wouldn't have done it for 48 hours and then let them go. It's about intimidating somebody and telling them, we control you. We control your circumstances, and at any time we can come and get you, and remember that. Now, Beverly's deportation order this second time was not canceled by the Public Safety Minister, even though I dare say maybe even more of us contacted him this time than the first time. And in a decision that I read and that I shared publicly, an immigration official said that separating Beverly from her infant son was in the best interests of her son, and that he would be able to adapt to what they called the new situation, meaning not having a mother in Canada. So these are the fights that black people have to fight just to be able to hold a little bit of ground. This is not moving things forward. This is fighting the very weight of the system that's on top of us all the time.
So then when people say that, oh, if you're white and somebody identifies you as white, that this is what oppression is in this country, so then I can threaten other people to go back home under a system that is literally threatening people to go back where they came from. You can see, how this speech that we may take as again, because I always push back against this idea of, that everything that happened in university is just like babies that are in this, like sheltered liberal world, and it doesn't tie to anything, because what we see happening here, we see in intensified ways moving between the prison and society. I think those points are important to identify. I know Todd has an essay here. So Todd, if you're wondering who is Todd, Todd,
Trap
who is
man.
Todd? Who is Todd?
Trap
Why is
man.
there a white
wondering
guy
who I
here?
am.
Oh, and shout out
Professor
to
Trap
Martha.
man.
We were talking about, I don't know if you were here when we were talking about the press release you just did. So this is Martha Painter from Women's Wellness Within. We had mentioned early in the show about the trans woman who was criminalized simply for being trans. Their solution, by the way, for her is that I guess we'll just strip search her with a man strip searching her like bottom and a woman strip searching her top. So this is our jail's idea of the appropriate treatment of trans people, which, by the way, is already challenged in court in Ontario and already to be found a violation of rights, because the police were doing this to trans women. And this was already argued, but now our prisons are doing it. And as Martha knows, this also happened in Nova, and the staff are continuously arguing that the violation of rights is they're having to strip search trans women, not women of all gender identity, not women being strip searched, but they have to strip search trans women. So they see that as a violation of their rights. So shout out to Martha for getting that press release out and the work you do with Women's Wellness Within, which is very tight. So
Shout out to the women who endure.
yeah, so Martha does a lot of doula work, healthcare work, prenatal work with women inside and mothering programs.
We've actually had Martha on my show too.
Okay, so we were moving to you. Sorry, I'm cutting you off.
No, go ahead.
Todd has something. We were saying who you were.
I thought you were going to tell me who I was.
Todd is like, so we have many historians. I want to shout out Isaac Saini, who's obviously the head of TYP, a very, very renowned historian in Cuban history, Black history, African Nova Scotian history. Todd is also a historian. What he does, a lot of his piece in Black Power Hour is our materials. So he collects and collates the materials that we then send into the prisons. We've been successful in them no longer calling it a fire hazard and just allowing people to have FedEx packages. So these are the small victories. So Todd gathers up a lot of our handouts. This mail is actually really important. If it were left up to me, it would be in my bag for 3 weeks, and it would never get to people. So we much appreciate Todd for that work and for finding the sources and doing it. So you do other things, but that's a bit I super appreciate.
No, I've turned my PhD into a mail clerk job, basically, and it's actually the best job I've had. I want to. The Journal of Prisoners on Prisons is a great journal which seeks to make scholarship out of the ideas, the writings, the evaluations of prisoners about prisons, which, of course, we all know prisoners are the last folks who get to speak, especially when the stories are about trans folks in the Chronicle Herald. The most recent issue of the Journal of Prisons on Prisons, which is available at jpp.org, is in fact a journal/collective submission to the federal government written by approximately 30 prisoners, talking about the major issues that had developed over the Harper government's years, their cutting of services, their upping of other kinds of punitive actions. And so all of these are written by prisoners. I'm going to read one from a woman, an Indigenous woman who's in the Grand Valley Institution for Women. This is the sad story, and I do have a better story to follow it up with. I was 21, naive, with an ego bigger than the men that I grew up with. I was facing a dangerous offender application while I was on remand for 4.5 years at Pine Grove in Saskatchewan. I was on segregation status for 18 months and what they call red card status. In Pine Grove, all my experiences over many years almost left me dead in a lonely, cold, isolated cell, feeling suicidal and hopeless. These past 3 years have been a wake-up call to my spirit. My sister and father passed away 3 months prior to one another. They were my only support throughout my life. I believe that I died inside when I was denied the opportunity to attend not only their funerals, but those of all my relatives. Not once have I been granted an escort to attend any of my family's burials. Yes, it killed me inside, but as a spiritual woman, the belief I have is that they are all around me. This has helped me spiritually, but has also left me painfully grieving to hear the voices, see their faces. Despite this, I am determined to make it in this life to carry on their legacy. Now, this is the second paragraph of this woman's submission, and it has a postscript, which ends with the following words. 5 days ago, I told the staff and my parole officer that I wanted to kill myself. I received an institutional charge for disrespecting him because he heard me say something else. The system is simply not set up to help people. And we hear stories about this kind of treatment all the time. Elle has collected dozens in her research of folks who are denied meds prescribed by doctors, made to feel as though they're criminal for asking for meds prescribed by doctors, and who don't have much hope of help when times get really tough. You did an excellent job talking about the folks who are here on immigration detention. One of the longtime listeners and callers of the show was someone who was arrested on an immigration detention violation. His name is Babu. He called into the show a lot. He wanted ideas that black intellectuals had about race and outer space for a comic book he was working on. We got him that. He finished the comic book and he's out. We're not saying those are related. But it speaks to something that not just Babu making the comic book, planning it from start to finish and doing it, not just these folks who write in despite everything that goes on, not just what Ed keeps writing despite what goes on to him. This is a kind of example of bravery and courage that
I also wanted to highlight, again, the criminalization of speech of women of color. So all the dangerous offenders that are women in Canada are Indigenous women. None of them committed a violent act before they went to prison. If they did commit violent acts, it was because of their incarceration, such as having children taken away from them. And
you said that
grieving.
all dangerous offenders
That a woman are Indigenous. The men, you have to be like a serial killer. So that, the colonel that broke into women's homes and wore their underwear and then serial killed women, he is not a dangerous offender. Just to give us, a context. But Lisa Nev, who simply said that she wanted to kill her rapist, was, when she spoke to a parole officer and a man who was raping her and had raped all these children, when she said, I just want to kill him, she was given a dangerous offender based on that, because of her thoughts, not that she killed anybody. So we see this repeatedly within our system. It's all Indigenous women. And again, none of them have committed violence. The violence has been done to them.
Can you help me understand a little bit more? Because we had tried to arrange a visit to go and see Ed when I came out here. We were hoping for two different opportunities. Iz is laughing over here because I know this is a frustration that you have to deal with all the time. But can you help understand why it's so difficult to simply arrange, if you come into town, to want to see somebody who's incarcerated?
So we'll go back and forth. So first of all, there's construction going on at Burnside. That's really important because most of the guys have been shipped out an hour and a half away. So everybody's in New Glasgow in the so-called new jail, which raises the question of prison expansion and construction and why we're spending all this money on doing that. While they're away, that also means their phone calls rates go from $1.25 a call up to $7 a call, plus with taxes and everything, it comes up to about $10 just to make one 20-minute phone call. So if your family can't drive, how do you get out there? We know the bus system doesn't work in Nova Scotia. So Ed's mother passed on Easter. It was a huge battle to get him out to that funeral.
Calls all week, back and forth.
And they didn't want to let him out. The prison was very supportive. It was the courts that were less supportive. And as a result of that, he changed his visiting list to put family on so that they could visit him and come and grieve with him. So when we tried to put you on the list, they said that he had had too many changes because you're only allowed 3 changes in the entire time you're in prison. Ed has been awaiting trial for 3.5 years.
Awaiting trial. That means remand, folks. That means not convicted of a crime.
Right. And he was almost forced to self-rep, by the way. So,
That's a whole
so in
other
3.5 years, you're allowed to make 3 changes. So if you, say, have your girlfriend on there and then you don't speak anymore because you've been incarcerated for 3.5 years, you're not supposed to make that change. If your family members pass during that time, which happened to him, you're not supposed to make that change. So you were not able to get on because there had been too many changes to the list. So that piece of bureaucracy prevented the visit.
And the thing that annoys me the most is that it's like an hour and a half down and hour and a half back. I do all the driving. And then you get there and you wait in the room, like the little waiting area for like a half hour because you have to be there a half hour early. You can't have your cell phone. So we're forced back into the caveman era and we have to talk to each other, which isn't really a bad thing. And then you get like, what is it, a 50-minute visit. So
over phones, no contact.
Yeah, over phones, no contact through the glass.
And they have.
It's not very sanitary. I put my hand in puke once. I wasn't very happy with that. And that's all for, so 3-hour drive, the gas money, all that, and it's for a 50-minute visit. So like even just.
And they have the creepiest children's books in the waiting room.
Yeah.
So they have this series of books about like visiting your parents in prison that are supposed to. Yeah, so I mean, let's talk about this for a minute. The idea that there are enough children with parents in prison that CSC thought it was worthwhile to publish books to teach children about visiting their parents in prison. So let's just digest that we don't actually just take the parents out of prison so they can parent their children. So they have this series of books. It's like Justin visits his daddy in jail. And the book is the creepiest thing because it's like this kid going on, I haven't told you about this, this kid going on this visit to federal prison to visit his dad. And it's like, oh, I drive with mommy and I haven't seen my daddy in 4 years. And then they describe all the security. So it's just pages of, first we go through the metal detector. Then they take a wand. That is to test for drugs. They rub it over mommy's wedding ring. They put it through. Then we go and stand in a room. We have to hold our arms out to the side. A dog comes and sniffs us. Like, it's literally pages of all of this, like getting searched, having a dog sniff you, like the one, and they have to, like, have this in the book for the child so the child can, like, understand what's going to happen to them when they visit daddy in prison. And then it says daddy's in a timeout because he was bad.
This is a strange question, but is this CanCon?
I don't know.
Because I want to find out who published that book and ask them a few questions about it. Right?
Yeah. It's a corrections facility. And then there's a follow-up, which is when daddy gets out and he's in a halfway house. So then they explain daddy.
There's a sequel?
Yeah, there's a sequel.
There's two of them,
which
right?
is when
I think
daddy's
there's
on
two.
parole. And so it explains about, like, daddy coming home and, like, having to see the parole officer and like the policing inside the house. So like
Look,
now
more
the child,
dogs.
Now the child has to be accustomed to like why daddy has to be like surveyed. So then you teach the child about like internal surveillance in the household. It's like the creepiest thing.
Watch out for the final of the trilogy though, when daddy gets radicalized. Watch out for that one.
Exactly.
That's on that note. One feature of our show, we use a lot of music. That's the biggest feature for the people inside Trust, and also the biggest source of complaints, which is obscenity. We keep coming back to this language issue, and again, this is something that we face constantly on the show. Shout out to Franchella from CKDU, who have been supporting this show through really difficult odds, because we play stuff that we really probably should not be playing, but she's made a huge effort with the station to support the requests of the prisoners. If you can understand that if you're in prison and there's one time all week where you get to ask for something and it happens, how significant that can be for your feeling of agency and freedom. So this is what music on the show is for people, that they know it's theirs, they know they can request it. We've had kids come on and like say can I have this for daddy? And like, so it's quite a community thing. But of course, a lot of the music is hip hop, and some of it's about being in prison, because this is the only music that talks about your circumstance. Like if you want to have a song about like, loving your partner while you're in prison, that's going to be in hip-hop. It's not going to be anywhere else. So people get very upset sometimes with some of the language in these songs and will complain to us about it, that it's obscene. And I always go on these rants about I think solitary confinement is obscene. But again, we're seeing this theme of how, language and like, if you say the F word, that's a problem. But, if we put people in prison away from their children, that's not. So anyway, that was a long way of saying that hip-hop news is a really important piece. We try to keep people connected to this world. That's another huge thing we don't think about, how fast this world moves. You're in prison for 2 years, you get out, you're missing technology, you're missing what happened, you're missing Instagram, So is in charge of our hip-hop news, so we're going to do a breakdown for a minute.
Yeah. All right, so I kind of do, like she said, hip-hop, entertainment news. I will keep people up to date on like new apps and just things that are going on, new movies, anything like that, just so people are aware, because like Elle said, when you come out after a couple years, it's awkward. You don't know how to readjust. You don't know what you've missed in all those years. People coming out and iPhones exist and they didn't when they went in, and what that whole experience is like. So I try to touch on some of those things. I never ever get through hip hop news because hip hop is so global that everything that kind of gets discussed relates to something else and someone else jumps in. So I'm gonna start very quickly with a shout out to Combat Jack. Combat Jack was a hip hop lawyer, entertainment lawyer for a number of early hip hop acts. He has since transitioned into a podcaster, and this is a podcast. He's one of my inspirations. Secretly, one of the reasons why we're kind of doing this. So he was recently diagnosed with cancer. So kind of all of hip hop is, sad and sending their well wishes to him and that sort of thing. So that's something that I'll be updating people on Friday. So get well to Combat Jack. And I do like the fact that he mentioned that he was going to be checking out some alternative medicines. I like that because I'm into that sort of thing. All right, a little bit of negativity into positivity. This week at Rolling Loud Festival, Little B was jumped by P&B Rock and A Boogie with the Hoodie. A Boogie with the Hoodie and P&B Rock are two newer artists. They jumped him over some critiques he made on Twitter regarding their music. He basically called A Boogie with the Hoodie Dej Loaf, which is funny because Charlamagne and them guys are now calling him Dej Boogie. So it's hilarious. But basically, as soon as he was jumped, they took his computer, so he wasn't able to play his set. But he got right on stage, and he was basically just like, I'm not mad at those guys. We can sit down and have a conversation at any time. It's all peace and love. We need to have peace and love in hip-hop. There's not going to be any retaliation or violence on my part. I just want to let them know that I love them regardless of what happened. And he did that like within 2 minutes of the altercation happening. So I think it's nice to see that sort of wave in hip hop. A lot of the news that I bring up is generally negative, and every once in a while you just get this really great positive story. And then later on that day, they ended up having a conversation and settling everything. So that's kind of cool. No one's interrupting me yet. This is amazing.
I'm just laughing at a positive story as people get jumped, but then.
Well, Little B handled it well. He handled it well, and all of hip hop is just kind of like on Little B's side and just like kind of telling A Boogie to check himself. So it's good, man. It's good. Okay, this is a fun local story. The Hells Angels are losing some memberships in some clubs because they can't afford to be members.
See, I don't trust this story.
I don't either, but it's just funny to me that they can't afford to be gangsters.
Yeah, so it's like neoliberalism comes to like, but I also think it's lies because it's all written by the cops, and I don't trust any story that comes from the cops.
Well, I think it's hilarious just kind of how they painted this story that they're losing membership because of they can't afford it. But then when you see how they criminalize black gangs, like with the HOK story, basically like 44 people being arrested or whatever the number was, they found X amount of money, and when you break it all down, it's like less than $200 per person, but they make it sound like it's a huge amount. And so just the way they like
because it's kind of funny because they're almost like nostalgia for like the good old Angels. It's like now you have to like people don't want to bike all those miles to like go to the major clubhouse. They're just lazy, these millennial bikers,
they just want to tweet each other. They should just live stream or FaceTime in their meetings.
I just remember, I think it was earlier this year that Hells Angels had a big convention in Ottawa. And one of the really like eye-opening, sometimes you get these like really unfiltered eye-opening glimpses into what your country really is. So hundreds of bikers are telling the world that they're coming to Ottawa for this National Hells Angels convention. And the Ottawa police issued a notice to everybody in the city: make sure you share the road if you see the bikers.
Wow.
we laugh, right? But it's that incredible preferential treatment, that idea that whatever they are doing, whatever they stand for, they can't really be that dangerous. They can't really be that hostile. And then we see on the other side that people who are criminalized for looking a certain way. When Elle talks about the creep of the police state, right? These are folks who are known to be involved in organized crime, and they're given this deference. But people who have never committed a crime, who are simply walking down the street because they're black, are seen to be members of a gang. And it's not about sharing the road with that person. It's about taking them off the road and asking them why they were there in the first place.
Rebecca Thomas and I were in the Halloween shop today doing this thing you'll see on CBC, and then we'll get hate mail. But guess what the only costume that pretty much had a black face on it was?
Go on.
The pimp costume.
Oh my God.
So pretty much all the costumes are illustrated by white people. Even the Egyptian god and Pharaoh and Nile Queen were all white people. And then the black costume, well, one of them they didn't want to call a pimp, so they called it Deluxe Leopard Man.
Why settle for regular leopard?
And then the other one was just like pimp, and that was like a black guy.
Wow.
So yeah. Also, there was you can dress up like a sex doll, but I won't get into that.
All right. I only have two more things. The next up is in sports is Kaepernick. Apparently, he signed a $1 million book deal with Random House imprint One World. They're a new imprint. I think they're only about a year old, so shout out because that's a huge deal. It's a black publishing company, from what I understand, and they also produced Jay-Z's book and Tanichi Coates' books. So shout out to them and shout out to Kaepernick. Obviously, I don't know what's up with him in the NFL. He still hasn't been signed. Apparently, he's been invited to some players and owners meeting or something like that. Or coaches and owners.
He'll never play again.
No, I don't think he'll play again either.
And to go to a local thing on that, I don't know if people remember when Craig Hodges was briefly here coaching
Shout
the
out to
Rain
Craig
Man.
Hodges,
Shout
my
out Craig
favorite
Hodges.
basketball player ever.
So he had gone to the White House in 1991 wearing a dashiki and handed George Bush a letter demanding that they not only pull out of the Iraq War, but also an end to poverty, policing in the black community. The contents of that letter had not been made public. I actually got to see it when he was here. Because Craig Hodges used to have me come to the locker room. I don't know if people know this. Like,
What?
Okay, before the Rain Man game, he had me, so it happened once during Black History Month. He had me come to the locker room and spit black power poetry at the players before a game, and they won, so then I had to keep doing it. Because that's sports superstition, right? So all through the playoffs, I had to keep going into the Rain Man locker room and doing super radical black poetry. And there was one Lebanese guy, but he was super cool with it. So yeah. That was a local piece when Hodges was here, right? I know he's written a book since then, but he never played again. And he told me I've given up. I estimate I lost about $30 million from handing that letter to George Bush. So.
All right, that is kind of the end of hip-hop news, but I wanted to get back to Missouma because I was holding on to this one point. Even though they have, dropped their complaint and everything, I want to know what happens to Dow going forward. They can't just cause all this havoc in someone's life and then just say, oh, we're done with the complaint and walk away. So, I'm not an academic or a university person, but I would like to see some type of investigation into how Dow handled the whole complaint, and let's expose what Dow's actually done incorrect here, and to be nice to say so that they could learn on a positive way and move forward so it doesn't happen again. And
a respectful dialogue, an opportunity for learning.
No, I think that's critical, though.
My last point on hip-hop news, though. Last thing, I swear, I just want to end it with fuck white fragility.
Hey.
That will get CRTC complaints. Oh, we're going to be off the air.
It's all good.
I want to tell you guys that I remember last year when you had me on the show, and I wanted to relate back something because, Elle, you talk about the importance of keeping people connected, all the things that people miss out on when they're incarcerated, all of the experiences that they're not able to have, the things that we take for granted. And I remember that there was a young woman who came on the air that day, and she read a poem that she had written because she was very close to getting out, I remember, and she was kind of reflecting on that time and reflecting on the things that she was maybe thinking about doing when she finally got out of prison. And we lost the call twice. So she ended up having to, be patient with us, and we tried to get her back on the line 2 separate times. So the third time that she started in on her poem, she got to say it all the way through. And I was just really touched because when that happened and when you guys were so patient and, we're going to stay on it and we're going to, Desmond, hold on, we're sorry, it's not usually like this and everything, I just was really, really, that made a mark on me because it showed who this work is really for, how much you guys really, really care about those little things, about that little chance that somebody gets to express themselves and to have that moment. So like, I salute you. I salute you guys for the work that you're doing. I see the difference that it's making. And it's an inspiration to all of us in the rest of this country who maybe don't know a lot about incarceration, because the nature of incarceration is to keep it away from the public view so that you can do whatever you'd like. You're helping to shine light. You guys are helping to shine light, and you're setting an example for the rest of us that we actually not only need to go into those spaces, but we need to build community through those spaces. I don't believe in prison. I don't want there to be a prison system in the future, but until we get there, we can never abandon folks. And I just salute you guys because you never do. You're always with your people.
Thank you, Desmond. We're going to throw to Todd to close us and move to Desmond. But I did move to Desmond's keynote, but I did want to say as well that everybody's news junkies inside prison, because it's like pretty much all they have. So one advantage of suffering, racism all the time is then you get to be on the news, and then everybody in prison sees you and gets hype about it. And they're like, yo, I heard you on the news this morning. Like, you were spitting fire. So they get like really hype. I'm sure if I say I saw Masuma, they'll be like, yo, she was on the news, So I guess like one thing that, bring on the racism so that the guys in prison can, hear more of us on the radio, and then be like, I know that person, and feel super hype as they like run around. It's
a funny thing to be like walking downtown Toronto and to run into somebody who just got out and who taught. That's the first thing that people will say is they will be like, I saw you on TV, or I saw this person that we know on TV. We were on the range. Everybody saw it. Everybody was talking about it. Everybody was getting hype. And those little moments of like glimpsing somebody you recognize from the outside, like that means a lot. It means a lot.
I'm going to throw to Todd because we are moving in time. We're trying to get to Desmond's keynote. But Todd has a ton of handouts. And again, please stick around after we do Desmond's talk to like discuss some of this material. He has a lot of really interesting poems, different documents. But Todd.
Okay, 3 little bits of news, and then I'll explain the document. One, we've talked about remand a lot because Nova Scotia has the highest rate of remand in the country. So not just the highest rates in youth poverty, lowest minimum wage, we're also leading in the highest number of people who are on remand, and we're talking about people who are in there from 2, 3, 4 years, waiting to be adjudicated guilty or innocent, and so on. So that's very important. A contrast to the story Elle told about the books, one of the people writing into Journal of Prisoners on Prison talk about one of their fellow prisoners trying to get their grade 11 degree to work through, build up to the GED, but the prison library could only give this woman the little engine that could. In order to improve your language to get up to a grade 11 rate. My favorite whole thing about the Masuma Khan thing is the one guy who said, what do you expect in a province where they only have to work 10 weeks a year and then they get the pogey? And someone said, what? And he said, oh, sorry, I confused Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. Well, that makes it okay then, I guess. And that sounds like a book. The Pogey led to Masuma Khan. And I'm claiming the right to write that, I guess.
They're never good with the details, are they?
Yeah. There's also the person who said Masuma discriminated against people of no color. And that was just so good. That was so good. Anyway, sorry. Thank you, Masuma, for experiencing all of this, because it's given to all of us. I just want to say, we gave you 3 pieces of paper when you received 3 pieces of paper when you entered today, along with our pamphlet. These are poems from 3 of the poets of what is known as the Black Cultural Renaissance of the 1980s. We have poems from George Eliot Clarke, Maxine Tynes, and David Woods, some of which speak to racial politics in Nova Scotia, some of which speak to racial and sexual politics on the university campus, and that's obviously part of what we're seeing here today. George Eliot Clarke will, in February, be releasing a poem he has been commissioned to write on behalf of Dalhousie's 200th anniversary. George Eliot Clark has written a great deal of poetry about imperialism on a global scale and about what he calls the Africadian experience. George is also a friend of the show, and so we asked him to give everyone here a list of readings. So if you want to do the homework to prepare to read the poem, which I have little doubt will come back and circle around to some of the issues we've talked about here, we've given you a great list.
And I also want to shout out Isaac and you're on the panel around the impact of enslavement on Dalhousie. So mentioning that the black faculty here, so Dr. Fua Cooper, Dr. Isaac Saini, I don't know if you're on it, Dr. Hewitt, there's a number of people that are on a panel that was commissioned to research the impacts of slavery at Dalhousie, and those findings will be released, am I correct? Yeah. So many of the black academics here have been doing that work to connect those legacies. So Isaac Saini, who's here, is one of those people, so also shout out to that. Are we good? All right,
good.
so that was...
I have one last thing to say before we wrap. One last thing. We do
right on time.
All of this sort of stuff by ourselves between me, Todd, and Elle. We pay for people's phones. We pay gas for people. We pay bills for people. We had a school supply drive. We have other initiatives like a day camp that we're working on, Mother's Day dinners and that sort of stuff, and whatever else Ed tells us to do. So it's all kind of funded by us. So if anybody wants to donate at some point, feel free. You can email us at theblackpowerhour@gmail.com.
We gonna pass the hat?
And yeah, you can
I don't
just
know,
like.
are we allowed in university? We might have to-
Oh, I don't know if we're. I don't care. I did. I'm sorry. Whatever. I don't go here. I don't know.
all
but
money
yeah.
raised goes directly into prisoner services, so we don't have any overhead. We don't take money. It all goes directly to people. So it will be stuff like, paying phones, paying bills to people. We pay some power bills or helping people keep their rent. So whatever people bring to us, we try to take care of. So none of it goes to like us. It's all going out there.
And yeah, that's it.
All right. So thank you, everyone. This was the Black Power Hour. Normally, you can hear us on CKDU 88.1, Fridays from 1:30 to 3. You can check the archives online. There's a bunch of other shows that you should also check out. Before we move to Desmond, we want to thank CKDU. Franchella is here recording, so station manager. If you're interested in getting involved in CKDU, it's a huge community research, especially for students. This is a good place to like just have your own show. Like you can say whatever. Well, no, you can't say whatever. But, so hit up Franchella. Also, if you want CKDU at your community event, they can be present. They can tape things, help get things into the archive. So definitely big ups to CKDU and the work they do in the Dal community, bringing a lot of community onto the Dal campus. It's a really important resource. Make sure that they stay funded, that they stay afloat, because a lot of people that otherwise don't come on this campus, such as people in prison, get connected through this resource. So it's important. Thank you to King's for hosting us in this space. Tim Curry, who when I was like, okay, we're having Desmond, I was just sort of like, yeah, it's here. And then he just was like, cool, let's run with it. District Labor Council, who have helped funded this, in Solidarity Halifax, who also are part of our funders. I have to thank the Mount. I'm the Nancy's chair. This is who's paying for the plane ticket that got you here. So we didn't do it at the Mount because we wanted a central location. We thought it was significant also within the journalism school, particularly around what Desmond does. So we wanted that connection. But the Mount, therefore, maybe the students had less time getting here. So shout out to the Mount. Thank you for it. I want to shout out Katie George Jim as well.
Yes, yes.
Just shout out to Katie for being like awesome. And Lynn Jones as well. We had an amazing trip to the archive. Tina came on Monday. Desmond was able to go to the archive and see the Lynn Jones collection, which was, I think, a really amazing and spiritual experience for everybody. So thank you, Lynn, for
You
putting
should
that
all
together.
go to Dal to see Lynn's archive.
St. Mary's.
St. Mary's.
Ooh, sorry.
All right. So
Oh, hold on. Shout out to Atlantic Livestream for taping and putting us on YouTube and Facebook. You should definitely check them out and inquire about having them at your event. They do quality work. It's a great stream. Check it out.
So normally there'd be music playing now. So like stretch, and we're gonna jump into Desmond. So this has
Shout out
been the
Elle,
Black
shout
Power
out
Hour.
my man Reed, shout out Todd. Thank you all very much.
I guess we're going to just take the floor yourself, I guess. We'll leave on top here, yeah. You want that? One more. You want to fill up on your water?
This will be good. Thank you.
cool this. There's 3 of you.
if every, yeah, I'm gonna try to welcome them back to their seats. If everybody could start making their way back to their seats, please. Oh. The whole time? Oh, the whole time that's what's been recording is on that. Oh, I didn't realize that. Now I just like, I did, but I thought.
We're about to start, but do your thing.
Yeah.
I'm sure you can feel very cool.
I'm standing here. I guess I'll intro. So, Desmond Cole, the reason why people are here tonight, you've probably seen him all over the place. Sort of burst into the national consciousness, but he was doing work before that, but burst into greater awareness about an essay, The Skin I Am In, which discussed racial profiling and his experiences with that in Toronto. That led to a documentary that aired on CBC. A lot of people in this room were part of that when we met at Pacha House, which is Balami's spot. So a lot of people I see were in that as well. But he's been doing really solid work in the community around police checks, also stuff like school boards and police in schools. So just constantly out there in the community, making voices heard, facilitating other people being heard. Most important person to have in this community that we wanted to bring in at this time with obviously the same issues that we're facing in our community. And like I said, requested by the guys. So without any more introduction, Desmond Cole.
Go for the mic though, Desmond.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I can chill. I can sit like this. Thank you, Elle, and everybody can hear me. The first thing I want to do, I have a couple of acknowledgments. So thank you very much to Kings for giving us this space and for helping to create this opportunity for me to be here. Thank you very much to all of the volunteers. Thank you to our live stream crew and to our tech crew for being here to do this for us. Thank you to L. Jones. I arrived on Saturday, and even though Elle has been in and out of 2 different other cities since the time I came, she's been taking care of me. She is the brain behind me being here and help me get to all the things that I needed to get to, meet all the people that I needed to meet this week. But Elle's been doing that since the first time I came to Halifax. And we went apple picking on Sunday. And I just tell you that to say that, like, it's so busy and there's so much work and there's so much conversations that are happening. But Elle also made sure I had some time to do the finer things, the things that we missed, the things that we would be doing if we didn't have to do all this other stuff. I just want to honor you, Elle. Thank you so much. I wanted to give a shout out to Masuma, who I know was probably quite overwhelmed by the response that she got when she walked in here earlier, but I have to give a shout out to Masuma Khan because she's been fighting something really, really scary and I think unimaginable for a lot of us. And she's been doing it with a combination of grace and integrity and of fury. She's standing up for herself, and I hope that everybody in this room makes sure going forward that she knows that it is not up to her, there's a community of people behind her, understanding the things that she is fighting for, and who's willing to stand beside and behind in order to support. So I shout out Masuma Khan. I want to shout out Katie George Jim too, as Elle did. Suma. Katie's story about being disrespected by the chair. Interview Katie this morning along of the Board of Governors at Dalhousie University has become overshadowed, I would say, by all of this other stuff with Masuma and a lot of other things that have happened in the news. But we had a conversation this morning on my radio program. We pre-recorded something. And I want to say, too, that we must not lose your situation of what happened. We must not forget that there's follow-up, too, once again with the Dalhousie administration in regards to your situation and how disrespectfully you were treated, Katie. We see you. We honor the struggle that you're also going through. And this same community, I want them to give you that same love and support. So thank you very much. And finally, before I start, I want to shout out somebody who probably doesn't think that this is about to happen. Shout out to Reed. Shout out to Reed for holding it down as well with Black Power Hour. And Reed's been driving me around since the time I got here too. I'm very grateful to him. But I also wanted to mention Amina. Amina Abawaji is right here, sitting in front of me. We just met, but I have to acknowledge you, Amina, because you are not only on the Ryerson, I was thinking my hometown now. You're not only on the Dalhousie Student Union witnessing and supporting what's going on with Masuma as she deals with this. You are also there, Katie told me this morning, supporting Katie in the aftermath of what happened with her at her Board of Governors incident. And aside from that, you're a student and you're dealing with all the rigors of having to be a part of these administrative groups and taking on these responsibilities, but you still find time to support your sisters. And I see you, right? So I want to say that that kind of work sometimes doesn't get acknowledged, but I see what you're doing. And I know the value, what you're providing to other women, racialized women in this city and on your campus who really need that support right now. So I cannot let that go unacknowledged. Thank you. I could do shout outs like the rest of the evening to like half the other people in this room. Shout out North Preston in the house. I was trying to think about what would be a fitting conversation to have this evening with all of you. I'm so happy to be here. And because we are in a journalism school, and because there has been a lot of really extra debate about myself and whether or not I really am a journalist and what it means to be a journalist, I think I will start there, and I think I will try to use that to frame the things that I want to say right now about journalism, about activism, and about our responsibilities in this country, even if we don't identify with either of those professions or categories. I had the pleasure of meeting a group of students just over here in the other room yesterday. We had a lunch together, and they talked to me about what it's like being a racialized student taking journalism at King's. I will not disclose the contents of that conversation, but I have been hearing the kinds of things that were said during that conversation a lot over the last couple of years since I've become more well-known for the work that I'm doing. And it's a conversation that just seems to keep repeating itself around not necessarily who is a journalist, not necessarily who is activist or an activist, or who's bringing activism into their work, but more so on a very fundamental level, who's allowed to talk, who's allowed to speak, and who is not. And I think about what we've seen with Musuma, I think that that's at the heart of it. Who's allowed to speak? Who's allowed to have an opinion? Who's allowed to express themselves? Who's allowed to be frustrated? Who's allowed to just be? And whose speech and ideas must be policed at all times lest this social colonial fabric unravel? What I'm seeing is that you could say that there are different rules for different people when it comes to who's allowed to have an opinion and who's allowed to voice it. Or you could look at it and you could say, no, they're the same rules. They're just applied completely differently depending on who we're talking about. And I think both of those things are often true. Sometimes there are different rules for different people, and sometimes there's one set of rules that get applied differently to different people. So, I started my career in journalism 7.5 or so years ago now. It was an accident. I never went to journalism school. So, I get to go home now and tell my mom that I got to talk to all you guys and be really cool about it. But this was not my experience. I'm actually a university dropout. So I don't even have a degree. I went to Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario in my 20s, my late teens, early 20s. It wasn't for me. It wasn't the right time. It wasn't the right thing. I left, and circumstances ended up that after a few months back at home in Oshawa, Ontario, which is a outer suburb of the Greater Toronto area, that I moved to Toronto proper, thinking I'm young, I'm able-bodied, I want to work. It shouldn't be that bad. It was pretty bad, though. It was pretty hard. It was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be, and I ended up doing a lot of different things. So I got a job at a coffee shop because that was the first thing that anybody would give me. I did a lot of stuff over the next little while about working in cafes or working in call centers. That one still, I think, is the worst that I've ever done. I would go to temp agencies and take whatever assignment they would give me, like filling out surveys at the York University GO Terminal bus loop to people who really did not want to fill out a survey. And in the time that I was doing that, I did not have a permanent address. I struggled to find housing. I would be jumping from place to place, from person to person. It was really hard. It was a lot harder than I thought. And then I had to reflect to myself, if this is what the situation is for me, who came from a really middle-class upbringing, whose both parents had a job and had a car, I went to school in a nice high school with really good resources and good teachers who cared about us and who had the time for us. If this was really hard for me in Toronto at 22 years of age, what was it like for people who didn't have all those things that I had? I got a job part-time working at a youth drop-in center. That turned into working full-time at the youth drop-in center. And that was all about supporting young people who in many cases were homeless, in many cases were underhoused, in many cases were dealing with drug and alcohol addiction. Many of these young people, and in general, many of the people on the streets in Canada, through studies that we've done, they are there via the child welfare system, meaning that the state was charged with taking care of them the first time and failed, and then they end up on our streets and in our shelters. I became really interested in advocating for the young people that I was working with, advocating for better housing, for better welfare rates, advocating for mental health services and services for people who were trying to get off drugs and alcohol, or at least reduce the use of drugs and alcohol or the harms associated with that use. I worked at a harm reduction facility, which meant that we weren't telling you don't use drugs because we know that's not realistic for every single person. We were saying, if you're going to, how can we reduce the harms for you? And if you're ready to do something more, how can we support you with that too? All these experiences really started changing my politics, really started changing the way I looked at my city and my country. But I always wrote, no matter what I was doing, because that's a passion I've always had. It's something I did from the time I was a little kid. I kept journals. They were always for me, though, right? I usually wrote for myself. If I wasn't having to publish something at school, I was writing for my own sanity, for my own enjoyment, for my own memories. And I did what, pretty much everybody was doing circa like the mid-2000s, which was I started a blog, right? It's very embarrassing. It's all still up, and I think about deleting it a lot. But the first blog that I started, which I still use sometimes, I called it Cole's Notes because I thought that was clever. And some of you in this room, yeah, some of you will get that. But then it was like, now I'm sharing things publicly with people, right? So I'm sharing things that I would have just had for myself before with anybody who happened to come across the page and read. I didn't think I was getting much of an audience, and I don't really think I was, but I wrote a piece in February of 2010 because we had this really problematic situation where police in Toronto had decided to assign themselves to dozens of our high schools. Armed police officers in full uniform with all of the powers and responsibilities of any other police. This really bothered me, and I didn't think it was safe for young people, but particularly young people who are black, young people who were like the homeless that I served, who often were already getting into trouble with police. Some of them are 15, 16, and they're talking about going back to school, but they faced such criminalization on the streets that the idea of having now to go to an institution where the police are stationed all the time, it just didn't work for them. I wrote about how I didn't think that this proposal was right, and a small publication, an online publication called Torontoist, contacted me and said, we'd really like to reprint what you wrote. And I was elated. I couldn't believe that this was happening. Later that summer, the leaders of the most rich countries in the world descended on Toronto for the G20 summit. It was that weekend that I really became a journalist. And it'd only been a few months since I had published that first story about policing. And when I witnessed, hundreds upon hundreds of police coming from other parts of Ontario to get in on this essentially orgy of depravity and of brutality, when I saw people being harassed walking through the streets of their own city, when I saw over 1,000 people arrested and detained in a makeshift prison without charges, released without charges, but also released after some of them were handcuffed for a whole day and night behind their back, released without their shoes, released without their identification, their wallets, the keys to their homes, without medication, without cell phones that they'd taken in, and the police kept everything. This was when I really became a journalist because I tried to tell that story. And I was one of the first people to have a really comprehensive documentation from folks who had been inside that detention center of what it was really like. And I was like, whoa, I'm a journalist. I'm really doing this. Like, I'm telling these stories and people are reading these stories and I think it matters to them. And I gained this new confidence that would grow. No one cared back then if I was an activist or if I was a journalist. No one cared that I had run for Toronto City Council 4 years before I had ever been published in a newspaper in 2006. Most people still don't know that. But no one cared because I wasn't being effective enough yet, you see? I wasn't bothering enough rich and powerful people yet for them to care. That would come later. That would come in first 2016. In 2016, I had been a Toronto Star columnist for about 8 months. That was the latest thrill in my life. Elle mentioned the Toronto Life piece that I wrote, The Skin I'm In. that piece and the wide readership that it gained launched a new moment in my career for me. And one of the things that came out of that was later on in 2015, the Toronto Star invited me to be a weekly columnist. And they put me on the front page of the newspaper the first day that I wrote and made a big deal out of it. Only 8 months later, I was summoned to meet with the acting publisher and chair of the board of the Toronto Star Corporation. His name is John Hondrick. And John Hondrick asked to meet me, even though I had never heard of him. Well, I had heard of him, I'm not going to lie. I want to throw shade, but not that much shade. I had never met him. I had never talked to him. We didn't know each other. And suddenly he wants to meet with me. I didn't feel like it could be for anything good, you know? He took me out to a fancy restaurant. He made me order anything I wanted. And it's like when you know somebody's about to give you bad news, so you're waiting for it. And John Hondrick's bad news that day, which now he denies in retrospect, of course, in hindsight, sorry, I should say, is that he asked me to stop writing about race so much. This is someone whose organization hired me on the strength of bearing my soul about a lifetime's worth of experiencing racism and being credited for having the courage to actually tell that story about myself. As an aside, that Toronto Life piece in 2015 was never meant to be about me. I don't usually write about myself, and I don't like to. I started writing that piece about other people in our community in Toronto who I deeply respect and whose work I admire, trying to do a profile for Toronto Life about Black experiences, plural, in Toronto. So I interviewed a whole bunch of Black people that I really admire, and I gave them my first draft, and they're like, nah, this is no good. But you did tell some really interesting personal stories about being Black. Would you expand on those? And I really didn't want to, and I didn't want to implicate my family, and I didn't want to bring up old experiences, and I didn't want a news editor to have to call my friends and be like, so Desmond says that he got stopped like this. Did it really happen? But I did it. And it's on the strength of a piece like that and of a lot of good previous work that I know that I did that the Toronto Star hired me. But now I'm writing too much about race. By the way, John Hondrick, who now denies that he said that to me, says, I didn't tell him he was writing too much about race. I told him he was writing too much about carding. Because you know how the practice of stopping and documenting people who are not suspected of a crime, you know how that has nothing at all to do with race, right? The same pressure that I experienced from the most powerful person at my newspaper is the same kind of pressure that journalism students for the last 2.5 years have been telling me that they're experiencing in the classroom. It's the same pressure that the very few writers of color in this country are telling me that they're experiencing when they talk about systemic racism, when they talk about white supremacy. It's a pressure that we feel as people of color and particularly as Black people in general. But I'm talking really specifically about how it's affecting our institution. We're told to shut up. We're told to take a more objective opinion, perspective. And I want to talk about this idea of objectivity because it really relates to what I said before about who's allowed to say something and who's not. I would like, and I said this to the students yesterday, I would like every single journalism school to host one of these really stupid debates that we like to host in this country. You know, where something that on the one side affects people's lives and well-being and on the other side is just a fun conversation for the other people. And they call it a debate. Well, let's host a debate in every journalism school in Canada. And let's ask not whether or not objectivity, this notion of being objective, let's not ask whether or not that is possible. It is impossible. We are human. We bring our biases with us everywhere that we go. They inform everything that we think. And I don't think it's realistic for human beings to try and say that they are not the sum of their experiences, of the things that they've taken in the media, of the things that their parents and their culture and their community have taught them. We all are. And that's okay. That's fine. And trying to reach this objectivity, to me, I don't think we should be asking, can we ever get there? Because we can't. I think we should be asking, should we be trying to be objective? Or should we be trying to encourage out those individual experiences, those individual thoughts and lived lives that direct us to ask questions about one thing and not another, that direct us to be really curious as journalists and as writers about one thing and not another? Should we not hone and nurture that instead of asking people to be objective or neutral? Because I can tell you what happens when we encourage people to be neutral. And now I will go back to what happened to Masuma Khan. Because a university is aware that a white person on campus is uncomfortable with things that a brown Muslim woman is saying. They're aware of that. They're aware that that has to do with a conversation about colonialism and celebrating Canada 150 that's being had all across the country the entire year. None of this is new. They know all this stuff. This student complains that this other student shouldn't be allowed to say what she says, not in the school, not in her capacity as a student leader, but on her Facebook wall. And the school says not that that's ridiculous, not that that would be a complete overreaction to something that you as a student don't like. They say, let's be objective about this one now. We don't want to say either way. We're being objective. So our way of being objective is that we're going to submit the student who's being complained about to months of a potential disciplinary process. And that the process is fair. The process was made by very fair people. And we will wait the outcome of that fair process. And in the meantime, we responsible adults who are watching as Masuma Khan is being slandered and attacked and threatened, we'll wait for our objective process to play out. We wash our hands of even saying anything. No one has reached out to our friend from Dalhousie, not even to say that this decision to withdraw the complaint today was coming. Masuma's name was not mentioned in the press release that Dalhousie made about rescinding this disciplinary action. That's what being neutral gets you, though. That's what being objective gets you. That's what happens when we ask human beings to turn off all of the things that they're experiencing emotionally, spiritually, and submit themselves to a process. A process, by the way, which mirrors the exact same colonial BS that Masuma was calling out in the first place. It is not an objective process. It is a process that's one of those things I talked about earlier that is like, you can say that this is the same rule for everybody, but you're going to apply it differently depending on who's involved. And that's exactly what I think happened. How this relates for me to journalism is when I see things like, for example, we had a situation in Toronto recently where a very racist police inspector who does a lot of press conferences, he made one of his press conferences to talk about the police attempt to apprehend several people who were wanted on armed robbery charges. The media really likes this police inspector because he tries to use inflammatory language as much as he can, and it gives them an easy thing to print. We don't have journalists so much in this country anymore as we have stenographers. They want someone to give them the news to copy down, and they want someone to make it easy for them. Inspector Mike Earle decided that he was going to use this press conference as an opportunity to air his racial grievances. All of the suspects that the police had been looking for in relation to these suspected armed robberies were black. So Mike Earle took the opportunity when he was saying this is who the police have been looking for to call them pathetic parasites. When Mike Earle said that, no one who was in the room who was part of the so-called free media challenged him or asked a single question about why he was using such dehumanizing language. It didn't occur to any of the media that dehumanizing criminals does not help the public catch criminals. It's just your opinion, and you're sharing it in this really, really powerful situation where all the cameras are on you. Instead, CB24, the Toronto Star, Sun, all the major media repeated the words pathetic parasites in their news stories, and most of them used it in the headline. And they used inverted commas to circle the words pathetic parasites. So someone is saying it, but we don't know who. Maybe it's shouting down from God saying it. We don't know who's saying that. But it's important enough that someone called black people pathetic parasites that you had to put it in your headline. That's called being neutral. Because if you had a moment of, creative and independent thought, you might think, why is this relevant? As a person who's supposed to deliver news to people, why is this relevant? And what should I do with that information rather than just copying it down and handing it wholesale to the reader who has no clue who's saying it or why? This is called objectivity. Objectivity is when we have situations like what we had with Yusra Kogali. Some of you know that name in this room. Yusra Kogali is a co-founder of Black Lives Matter Toronto. Very similar story to Masuma's story, where Yusra, during Black History Month, was receiving a lot of racist and vile attacks from people online who didn't like that she was talking about Black History Month, and who don't like her organization, and who don't like her advocacy and her activism. Because you see, it doesn't matter what you call yourself. If it's what you say to fight for black liberation, if it's getting out there, people are going to go after you. And they're going to say it's unfair that you're saying the things that you say, no matter if you're a journalist or not. They're going to hold you to some invisible standard. Yusra said, after receiving all kinds of hatred from white people, mostly men, she tweeted out, Allah, give me the strength not to cuss or kill these men and white people. Please give me the strength. Please, please, please. And the media, who are so neutral and who are so objective, they didn't simply repeat what Yusra said like they did the racist inspector and say here was her opinion. No, this was about a racist attack by a black woman on white people. Just like in your case. Just like that. And there was all of this editorializing going on, and there were all of these calls for Yusra to be removed from a community-based consensus organization. So 10 minutes ago, you didn't know who was a part of BLM Toronto, and you didn't care. And 5 minutes ago, you don't think that they are even allowed to be a group, but now you want them to use their power as a group to censor someone else within the group. I really went really hard as I could for Yusra in that situation to say the following. It was like I hoped an outburst of that independent thinking that I'm talking about, because what I said was this, and nobody else was saying this in Toronto loudly. And I think that's not because people didn't think what I'm about to say. It's because a lot of them were scared off by the way that our media comes for people of color and anybody who supports them. I simply said this. If you receive the kind of treatment that Yusra was facing, where white people, and particularly white men, are coming for you online because you talk about black liberation, and then they're saying things about your body parts, they're saying things about violence that they would like to do to you or to people around you, they're saying how they would like to kill you, how they would like to shut you up. Whether you're Muslim, whether you're Christian, whether you're Jewish, whether you're none of those things, but if you know anything about the Abrahamic tradition, what Yusra said was, God, these people are testing me. These people are attacking me. These people are trying to bring out the hatred that I know is in me because it's in all of us. But I pray, give me the strength not to return the hatred that they are showing me back on them. I pray. That was all that Yusra was doing, and that is one of the most noble and honest prayers that anyone can offer up. And all these people out here in the media who are Judeo-Christian and who rep that every day, they should get that. But for some reason, they forgot one of the most essential teachings of their own cultural tradition because they were too busy being objective. So I don't buy it. What I say when I do interviews like that and when I do media around these things is that I am not objective. I have a bias and I declare it openly. But what is yours? Are you going to come out from behind this veneer of objectivity and actually tell me what you think? Because then it'll come out. Eventually it'll come out when you print pathetic parasites and somebody has to tell you that that's not an appropriate way to describe human beings. There was a situation in Toronto recently where a woman by the name of Dion Renee was physically and sexually, according to her, I will say that for legal purposes, but I believe Dion, but according to her, she was physically and sexually assaulted by a police officer in the lobby of police headquarters in September before the last police services board meeting. You want to talk about objective media? Dion Renee has a disability which prevents her from easily walking upstairs. So she had gone to the reception desk at the police headquarters, which is where police oversight meetings are held, to get the elevator. Dion's been doing this for years, and she goes and asks for the elevator every time. So this black woman with a disability goes up to the counter and says what she always says, could you please open the elevator for me? And the police officer who's at the desk on the other side of 2 feet of marble and glass says no. And she says, well, then can you call a supervisor? And repeatedly asks, and the police officer, again, declines. Then that officer, who's being egged on by other officers who are watching all of this and having a great old time, that officer who she was initially speaking to, whose name is Jamie Party, he puts on the gloves that we see police wearing. Remember, he's inside a building behind a desk. There are 2 security gates between him and anybody from the public that have to be fobbed in order to open. He puts on gloves. He goes through the 2 security gates that I'm describing, comes right next to Dion, who's been standing there hoping that he's going to let her upstairs the whole time, and he puts his hands on her. And that's when she says that he physically and sexually assaulted her. The space in 40 College Street where the police headquarters are, that lobby is a huge open space. And then there are stairs that go up to a balcony that you can look down from the 2nd floor. There were media on those stairs with a bird's eye view. There were media on the balcony. There were media taking pictures of a police officer with the full weight of his body on top of a black woman who was screaming for her life. There were media on the balcony using their cameras to film down the aftermath of this, where a traumatized Dion Renee is demanding that someone come and help her. For 2 weeks, there was not one news story written, not one TV story run, not one radio broadcast detailing these, except for my show where I had Dion on the air to talk about what had happened to her. But that all changed about 2 weeks later because we held a press conference for Dion so that she could tell everybody what had happened. And later that afternoon, when all the news agencies who had come to the press conference dutifully went back to their offices to package together a story, lo and behold, all this footage of Dion Renee traumatized appears. An executive from one of, or a senior person from one of these news agencies who I criticized online for holding on to this kind of footage of a criminal offense. She told me that I twist everything around. She told me that I was prejudiced against her news agency and that they were just trying to do their best to make sure that they had all the facts before they said anything. But I know that none of them were going to say anything until we did. 2 weeks. That's called objectivity, everybody. And it's the greatest threat to us doing our job as journalists because it means that we have to turn off our human instinct when we see something like that and pretend that there is some neutral course that we need to filter all of our work and our thinking and our emotions into, which will make it more proper for the consumption of the public. And that's bull. We can't live like that. And I see this being replicated in journalism schools across this country. I see students who want to write about blackness being told that that's not the right angle. Why don't you try this one? Why don't you talk to some experts? We have an expert coming to Halifax soon by the name of Scott Wortley, who's going to tell all of you about carding statistics. So Scott Wortley, who does excellent work, don't get me wrong, Scott Wortley has done that work for our police in Toronto for many years. So the police disproportionately target, stop, detain, question, document black people. In some cases, they beat us up, they arrest us, and then they charge us with beating them up. They take us to jail, they threaten our family members, they break up families, they get kids called Children's Aid on them. So Scott Wortley does the very polite thing of breaking all that down. And he's not like me. He's I guess maybe he's objective, but he doesn't tell them to stop doing this bullshit. He just analyzes it and says, here's what you are doing, and you need to come to the right conclusion, which is his role as a researcher, and that's fine. But I want to know why they are inviting the Halifax Human Rights Commission, the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, excuse me. I want to know why they're inviting Scott Wortley to be the expert, to come tell them about carding after it was revealed here that black people are 3 times more likely than white people to be stopped. So that means that there are a lot of black people getting stopped by the police in Halifax and the Nova Scotia area. But they're not the experts Scott Wortley is. And I think that that's a really big problem about this idea of expertise, which feeds back into only taking the voices that are objective, that are dispassionate enough to not let their emotions and their experiences taint this dialogue. Is this the world that we want? Because it's not the one that I want. So the question always comes back to, Desmond, are you an activist? Are you a journalist? What are you really doing out here? You can call it whatever you want. I'm not going to entertain that discussion. But I know that if we weren't of the activist spirit, for example, those of us who supported Dion Renee, that footage that I hope now has been turned over to the Special Investigations Unit would never have even made it to TV. And by the way, that's another important thing here is we have a Special Investigations Unit. You guys have CERT, right? Or Serious Injury Response Team. Same idea. So the Serious Injury and Response Team would want to see footage of an alleged assault, sexual and physical assault, on a member of the public by the police, now wouldn't they? But if you don't think that that's a news story as a media organization, and that's literally your only job, are you going to hand it over to the CERT or to, in our case, the SIU? I had to say this publicly. Like, I hope you guys are handing this stuff over. Because again, the idea that a crime can be committed by police against the public is part of the objective frame that our media is using. And let's be really honest, because I work in newsrooms. Because of that stenography culture that I mentioned earlier, that desire not to have to think and get emotionally involved, but just to tell some detached story, well, our media are beholden to police to write about crime. Without police, they don't feel like they can actually tell you what's happening. So I have literally seen police being the source of a quote about police brutality against the public. So a member of the public is assaulted, and literally the media's only source is going to the police and being like, so they say you beat him up again. Did you? Did you do that? No? Thanks for your time. Is it activist to demand more? Is it activist to say that our responsibility, as some have said about journalism in the past, is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable? Do we actually believe in that anymore? Or are we just stenographers now? Are we just trying to play it safe now? And I wouldn't be being fair and honest with everybody if I didn't also add that this is a corporate media culture that we're talking about here. That all of us in journalism are hoping to get that job at CBC or CTV There's only a few in this country, mind you, right? That'll actually give you a decent job with a somewhat decent living. If you play their game. But this is about making money. It's not about telling the truth. Sometimes they do tell the truth. I'm not going to say that, but that's not the first goal. And I think it explains what happened to me at the Toronto Star very well, because I was quite a popular columnist at the Toronto Star. I was bringing the Toronto Star an audience of people, particularly black people, who were not reading their publication, who are not going to their website, who are not clicking on those links that get advertisers money for getting your eyes on their ad. That wasn't happening in a lot of communities before my column. So I was giving that to the Toronto Star in exchange for having work. But what did the Toronto Star really give me? I didn't have a contract at the Toronto Star. I didn't have benefits or salary at the Toronto Star. I wasn't protected by the union at the Toronto Star. And ultimately, when I left the Toronto Star for the way they treated me in April of this year, I left because I did that thing that you don't do when you're objective. I actually said what I thought. I went to a police services board meeting 2 years, almost exactly 2 years, after the mayor of the city of Toronto, John Tory, said he was going to cancel carding, and he hadn't done it, and the police still had access to our information. 2 years after a promise by a mayor who came out with tears in his eyes, saying that no community's relationship with him was more important than the black communities. But he didn't do what he said. So I went to the meeting 2 years later, and I held a demonstration saying, "You've lied. You didn't do what you say you were going to do. I know that you haven't. So you're not going to get to stay at mission accomplished on this one without me saying first that this is not what you promised us." I put my fist up in the air, and I refused to leave the board table. I gave a deputation like I've given dozens of times in my city, and like I had done while being a Toronto Star columnist. And in fact, Toronto Star reporters were writing stories about my activism, and somehow they figured out how to navigate this quandary: is Desmond an activist or a journalist, by just saying in their story that I was both and moving on. But when I stood up in defense of black liberation at that meeting in April, and I refused to leave, well, the Toronto Star got wind of that, and they called me into their office and said, "Desmond, activism or journalism, choose one." And I said, "I choose my community. Fuck you." I lost out on a lot of money that I could be making right now if I had kept my mouth shut and been objective. I lost out on a lot of the profile that column was bringing me. A week after that happened with me, one of the most prominent pundit voices in this country, I'm sorry to say this, it's not a good reflection of Canada, but Jonathan Kaye, keep groaning. Jonathan Kaye decided to come to the defense of a writer who had said that cultural appropriation of indigenous people's culture and languages and spiritual practices, that's a good thing. That stealing other people's culture and passing it off as your own, pretending that you are them, pretending that you have their history, that you share their pain when you don't, that's fine. And this writer went as far as saying that there should be a cultural appropriation prize for people in Canadian writing who do that properly. And after he said that, John Kaye took to Twitter being like, "I don't know what's wrong with what he said. Oh my God, can you believe people are mad at him? Like, I just don't get what's wrong with it." Because that's Jonathan Kaye's only card that he can play, is to pretend that he doesn't understand what racism is, and then to take up all kinds of space. So he ended up leaving his position at the Walrus shortly after he did that. And he claims to this day that it had nothing to do with the humongous backlash that he received for that. But part of that backlash that I think went somewhat unnoticed was an incredible writer and poet and activist named Leanne Simpson. And Leanne, who is Indigenous herself, when she heard about what John Kaye was doing and that he was still in his position as editor-in-chief of The Walrus, said, Walrus, I want you to take down from your website everything that I've ever written and published for you, and I'm giving the money back. This is a woman that has kids. But I hope that what that message that I sent, that Leanne sent, that other journalists who are willing to be activists and who are willing to actually stand for what we believe in, I hope that the message is that there is no progress without sacrifice, that it's dangerous for us, but those of us who are in these positions who have made it this far, we need to make the sacrifice. Because if a journalism student tries it, maybe they don't get out of their program with a degree. And I worry about that, and I mentioned it when I resigned from the Toronto Star, that if this is how I'm getting treated, that one day I was on the front page, and the next day I'm leaving seemingly in disgrace, and I was supposed to be one of the most celebrated writers in this country. What's happening to journalism students who don't have all of that profile and don't have all these thousands of people being like, why did you do that? What are they going through if this is what I'm going through? And it's particularly black women that I see and meet in journalism programs across this country. When I meet black people in journalism, they are disproportionately, overwhelmingly black women. And I know that that comes with extra layers of discrimination, extra layers of scrutiny, extra layers of intolerance for ideas and speech and dissent. So again, I'm in a position where I felt like I can stand up to show other people we need to push this forward for you. You might not be able in your positions to take this risk, but we can, and we have a responsibility too. So these days I don't worry so much about this label. Are you an activist? Are you a journalist? I think it's my responsibility not to be objective, but to be true to the things that I believe in and to fight for those things. And I think that that's what all real good journalism actually is, when it's not pretending to be like, I don't know, you tell me, you decide. When it's being honest, it is fighting for something. And you know something? When a child gets hit by a car, we don't get angry at the journalists who tear up when they're asking questions about this or who are giving their report by the roadside vigil on the 6 o'clock news. We don't say they're not being objective. We're feeling what they're feeling. And sometimes we're grateful that finally somebody who's in that position is exhibiting some true emotion. I think we feel this way often about politicians too, those rare times when politicians are actually going to exhibit a little bit of honesty and emotion. We appreciate it because it's always hidden behind these veneers. So nowadays, I try to worry very much about being true to myself, about being true to Black liberation, and being true to the struggle that I'm in and that I know other people like me are in. And that's the message that I have, not only for journalism students in this school, not only for all the students at King's, not only for all the students at Dal and at Mount and everywhere else in this province and across the country, but this is the mission that actually all of us are on. The power that we have in this resistance is speaking the truth relentlessly, fearlessly. That's why I love L. Jones. Because when you have the power to be relentless and to speak the truth, that is a form of social capital greater than any money that anyone can give you, greater than any position that anybody can give you. I walked away from the Toronto Star with my integrity, but I also took my significant audience with me. And I will recreate that somewhere else to continue this fight. And I say to you all that when I criticize the corporate media, I have this in mind, is that we do have to fight to create new channels for ourselves to tell the truth if the corporate and existing ones will not allow for that to happen. There are journalists in corporate media who are able to pierce through sometimes, and I salute them. I don't accept these inside versus outside of the system dichotomies. We can do both, and we have to. But again, I think that often this lazy thinking tells us that there's only two options, and usually one of them is about supporting the institution and the powerful, and the other is about supporting the underdog. And I reject that. We just need to do the work that we need to do because we believe in it and because it's right. So I want to stop there. I want to say, again, thank you to King's. Thank you to the sponsors of this event tonight. Thank you to Elle. Thank you to Iz. Thank you to the people that I honored at the beginning for the incredible emotional work that you're doing. We see you, we love you, we care about you. We want you guys to take care of yourselves too so that you can continue doing this fight. And I want everybody in this room, who is not the few people that I have named tonight, to understand that this responsibility falls to you. It does not fall to me. It does not fall to Elle or to Sylvia, who I see here. It doesn't fall to those who are courageous enough only to speak on behalf of themselves and people around them. It falls to us all. And when you sit and you watch TV and you see one of us and you think, I am so glad that they're out there, the next thing you should be asking yourself is, when am I going to be out there with them? Thank you. Thank you very, very much. So,
Time for questions. I know Lynn Jones in particular wanted us to leave the discussion. It is after 9, so if people want to understand childcare and everything, people all feel bad when they have to leave, so it's okay if you have to leave. See people apologizing. But there is, you don't have to apologize, but there is time to stick around for questions and also for us to talk about other things. So if Desmond's all good, we'll just all hug each other.
we should talk. I don't know how to register anything, eh? I am leaving, but...
as people are leaving,
I'm easy to find. Like my email and all that stuff is really easy.
Desmond, I guess I'll moderate. So... can you take the handout?
Hi, how are you? Nice meeting you. Lovely to meet you. Thank you for everything.
I'm blanking on her name because she's new. Olivia. Olivia.
Oh, I do actually.
Yeah, but
No, it's okay. Yeah, I know. And I actually sent him in a bunch of stuff today, but I've got the 3 things I handed out tonight.
Thank you so
That's
much.
already
Thank
in
you
the
for
mail?
coming.
Yep. So these are the ones from tonight. It's just the same 3 pages you would have. Yeah. But the rest has all been sent in to him already.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming out.
So are you?
How do we bring questions?
Well, thank you so much for coming out.
I know it. You should.
All right, people lining up to talk to Desmond. Do we need to do a like?
No, I think we gotta get to questions.
Okay, so you can ask questions.
So-
People can also greet Desmond and stuff as they leave.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming.
Please, I guess yell at please.
Hey!
Last one.
Yes. Okay, so for those of you who can stick around,
Yeah, we're getting questions from text. Evelyn White, another fabulous journalist, works for the Halifax Examiner, is like, we gonna see the questions now? So, thanks. Shout out to Evelyn as well. So
shout out
Desmond, go
Evelyn.
ahead.
Thank you. All right. So we can take questions now. So I think we're gonna bring a mic around if we can.
I'm gonna try for you guys to like make your way up. Don't worry about that. Don't worry. It's all good. But yeah.
If we may.
Let me know when I should go. Okay, go. So can everybody hear me or no?
The room has no speaker. That's just for the recorder.
Oh, just for the recorder. Okay. So I actually recently became the editor-in-chief at St. Mary's, like the university newspaper.
Congratulations.
And kind of like you, I really stumbled upon it completely. Like I don't even have that much of a background. I mean, I'm only doing my undergraduate, but I never had that much of a background in wanting to do journalism. It was strictly, I stumbled upon it. I was like a contributor, and then they asked me to be an editor, and now like I got this position. So one of the things that I would, as somebody who comes from a minority background and also someone of color, and obviously has biases, for sure. Like that's something that I have to think about all the time is I do want to bring up issues. And that's one of, I guess, one of the biggest hurdles is the fact that should I, like, in making pieces and publications, how should I go about, like, what wisdom would you give me in a sense of how should I, because I have to sit in front of a board. I don't have to talk about the content of the paper, but I do have to sit in front of a board. And I obviously have to think about my relations with the university as well as representing the student body. So in your opinion, what kind of advice would you give me? Yeah.
It's a good question. I think that, so I mentioned before that I often get these questions about should you work inside the system or should you be outside, and how I don't necessarily accept that those are the two choices, right? That we can do either. But there are strategic considerations when you're on the inside. There's no doubt. But I think that in being strategic, you must still be yourself. This idea that you can hide who you are inside of an institution, maybe endear yourself with the people at the top, and then later on you can be who you really are? No. That's like when politicians have a group of supporters, and when the election comes around, they tell their group of supporters, listen, there's a whole bunch of other votes out there that I need to get. So you're going to hear me saying and doing things that don't sound like me, but don't worry, I'm still with you. And when we win, I promise I'll go back to all those things that I said I believed in before. If you're beholden to that on the way up, you're always going to be. So I really do advise you, in the ways that you can express yourself, do so. Don't allow people to feel surprised one day when you express an opinion, when you want to engage in a project that they might not be comfortable with, right? They ought to know from the outset that that's what they're dealing with, and that's who has risen into this position. You should not try to hide it, but you should be trying to engage that constantly. And I think what happens then is they might not always like the things that you're offering. They might not always like the angles that you're taking, but they can't say you didn't tell them. They can't say you weren't upfront and honest about it. So, and you know, always tie it back to what's the mission of the publication. So I mentioned afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted before. The Toronto Star operates on what it calls the Atkinson Principles. And the Atkinson Principles are part of like the founding idea behind the newspaper. And this is supposed to be like, this is a social justice paper. Some people don't know this. The Toronto Star was actually started by strikers. Folks who were on strike who felt that their voice was not getting heard in one way said, we've got to find our own way. And isn't it interesting how now that's the corporate behemoth that told me to stop talking about race? But didn't unionize me, didn't pay my benefits. You see how it's always really about labor in the end. I should assume that whatever publication they have at the school, that it expresses its core values somewhere. Remind people when you have conversations that are difficult that, like, I'm trying to achieve these values. I'm trying to tell students stories. I'm trying to shine light in places that light is not shone often enough. And yes, that will make people comfortable, but here's why I'm doing it. And I think that there is a student body that wants that needs that kind of coverage. Keep the lines of communication open and don't hide who you are is a summary of like what I would say about that. Yeah. You're welcome.
Hi, Desmond. Thank you so much. That was amazing. Let me grab my notes, actually. 'Cause I just okay, so I'm a little stuck on what you were talking about in regards to objectivity earlier. I think that was so brilliant, but I just kept thinking about it, and really trying to understand in practice how we can really do that. Here's what I mean, because I think in theory it's great. You said, you know, we're all the sum of our experiences, we're human, we all have biases, we're going to bring that to the table inevitably, which is so true. But does the opposite of objectivity, does it have to be subjectivity? Can it be something else? Because I think now, and I'm thinking about, you know, school. I recently completed my degree, and then, you know, high school, which wasn't that long ago. And, you know, as a student of color, as a black student, there was a lot that was really frustrating. There was a lot of institutionalized racism. But I think often, you know, when challenging some of these things, and, you know, black students are always told, okay, well, you're getting emotional now, you're a bit subjective, be objective about it. And so it's really difficult in practice, you know, like even in politics now, when we look at a lot of the debates that are trending, whether in Europe or whether right here, some debates, you know, like some of the bans on Islamic dress or travel bans. We had the case of Maher Arar. All of that was subjectivity, you know, on the part of government, predominantly white people. All of that was subjectivity, but it was so valid. It carried so much weight. Elle spoke about one of the female prisoners, and she rolled her eyes at the parole officer. And then for that reason, the parole officer said she's still dangerous. I think that is so subjective. But, you know, it was considered valid in that, like in that context. So it carried weight, you know, so on. So let me see. So, yeah. And then even in the case with Dion Renee, I think you declared, you know, I have my prejudices. You declared what your prejudices were. You mentioned that. And so it's a bit problematic. I hope my question is really clear, because I'm just wondering, when it in practice, how does that, when we say, you know, like, I'm declaring my biases, I am biased, I am subjective in this way, I don't think it has to look different, because for people like us, for black people, or for people of color, people from marginalized backgrounds, our subjectivity, it doesn't carry a lot of weight. It's not seen as valid.
That is
and, you know, coming from white people, from institutions controlled by white people, where white privilege is, right? Their subjectivity carries a lot of weight. So, you know, so I think when we say we can't be objective, can we be?
Yes, I'm really grateful for the question. So I'm taking notes here, and I want to say a couple of things about it. And this has been on my mind so much in the last year. So first of all, I want to talk about objectivity versus facts and truth. Objectivity, I don't equate with facts. Facts are just facts. Okay? So we all make mistakes in the news industry, every single one of us. When you make a mistake, correct your mistake. If your mistake affected somebody, apologize to that individual and name them. Always. Do it unequivocally, too. Don't give these half-assed apologies that people in power give when you make a mistake. Do it for real, because everybody does it. If I say that something happened at 9:30 a.m., but it happened at 9:30 p.m., that is not a lack of objectivity. It is a lack of stating a fact properly. It's an error. If I know that something happened at 9:30 a.m., but I say, knowing that it happened in the a.m., that it happened in the p.m., that's called a lie. Okay? We have words for this. Language is really good at distinguishing these things. I think that the problem with objectivity is that it becomes such an issue, and most of the time an issue, not when we're disputing is that a fact or not. Usually objectivity doesn't come into that. We could just say, well, here's the verification, you're wrong. No, usually what we're actually saying is we're policing your opinion because we think that your opinion is not objective, which again is just It's impossible to achieve, and I don't know why that would ever be something we would strive to unless our intention is to erase our own opinion, which is unfortunately what a lot of what we do is in journalism. So how do we practically go about this? Like, if our subjective opinions don't carry weight, there are many reasons for that. One of them is that the news industry in Canada is extremely white, but when you go deeper and you only look at people who are paid to give their opinion, columnists, pundits like John Kaye, all these talking heads that you see on TV, they are even more white than the already exceptionally white. No, for real. And I am not talking about them as individuals. I'm saying, like, as a collective, there is even more whiteness in punditry than there is in general reporting. That is a fact. The individuals who get hired to give their opinion are almost always white. And you have people in this country who have been giving their opinion for a good 45 or 50 years right now, Rex Murphy, who are still being employed. What does that man have to say anymore? By the way, Rex Murphy, when I talk about stating your biases openly, okay? Let's talk about that for a minute. Let's talk about what these folks get away with. Rex Murphy always talks about how he's not sure about climate change. Rex Murphy has given speeches for big, big money to the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers in this country. He doesn't tell you that, though, when he gives his latest hot take, does he? I think he should. But more than that, because he's an opinion maker. He's a columnist. I expect him to be coming from a certain perspective. But how many people in this room know that Peter Mansbridge also gave speeches for undisclosed thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers? And then when you watch The National at night and there's controversy about the oil sands and how much pollution it's spewing into our atmosphere, the person who's giving you that news is being paid by the oil company and doesn't even tell his own bosses how much they paid. That's the public broadcaster. So when Peter Mansbridge said he was leaving, I was like, yeah, get out, bro. Don't let the door hit you. Because I don't think that that's real journalism. I definitely don't think it's objective. But I don't think objective exists. So I am not asking all black people to go up asking for a job and being like, by the way, I'm extremely biased. I'm not advising you to do that. I am advising you, like I said, to try and be straight with the facts. And when you make a mistake, like everyone does, to be straight about your mistake and correct it. Because that builds integrity, like I was talking about before. But I'm also talking about asking to write opinion pieces explicitly. Saying, I have a viewpoint on X or Y that I think needs to be shared, and I want to give my opinion. What do you think about that? Let's be open, because I think what I see a lot of the time from young journalists too is that they start off in that kind of reportage, not giving opinion necessarily, but just straight reporting, which has a big role to play. And then they kind of feel pulled one way or another for a certain issue or a certain story that they really feel like, you know what, I have more to say on this one. But they're scared, so they kind of do it half and half. So they write a piece where they're trying not to give their opinion while trying to give their opinion, because they're afraid that if they come out full blown and say it, that they're going to be reprimanded. And what I'm saying is you got to put that out front and say, here is an opinion that really needs to be heard. It hasn't been offered for these different reasons, and I think I can add something to that conversation. What do you think about that? And if the answer keeps being no over and over again, then you can start using that as ammunition to say, okay, but we've had 15 opinion pieces recently in our publication, and none of them have been by people of color. None of them have been by women. We've been writing about trans rights because the government just passed new trans legislation, but we've never had a trans person on our campus ever write anything about that issue or any issue. So why are you only giving the chance to make opinions to this group of people? You can build on it, but you can do so in a way, I believe, that says I have something valuable to contribute, and I'm asking your blessing to go and do it. And I want to add one other thing to that too. Folks who are pursuing this need to ask their institutions to build in supports for racialized people, supports for women, supports for trans and gender nonconforming people, supports for a lot of different other people who are vulnerable. Because you ask women, no matter their age, no matter their race, no matter their background, ask women who give their opinion in this country what it's like when they write an opinion piece and what comes back in their inbox. And they will tell you the stories. Because women are not allowed to give their opinion in Canada. And they, if they're going to be sustained to do that work and particularly to offer opinions that are not readily out there, they're going to need support. And I think that part of doing this work for any serious news organization and even in our schools is to say, what resources does the school have for that kind of stuff, if they have any? And if they don't, that's another issue. And you can write about that issue. But if they do have those, how do we divert those resources towards our journalism students so that if they write something that other people are going to respond to, that support is already in place for them, so that they don't burn out, so that they don't back off when they really have something important to say. I hope that begins to, answer a very, very important and good question.
All right, I think there's a question over here. Sorry, you got to come to the mic though.
Thank you very much for such a wonderful talk. I wanted to broaden the discussion further, looking at how international media covers stories beyond Canada.
Yes.
What do you think of the media era, basically? Do you think we are going back to what we used to see as media imperialism, or do you still think we are in an era where the media is heavily regulated? Or do you think we should encourage those living in other parts of the world to be able to tell their own stories rather than international media tell their stories?
That's a great question. So I know, for example, my brother here is from Sierra Leone, and my parents are both born in Freetown, Sierra Leone. And I actually want to talk about Sierra Leone for a minute in this context of this question, because I know that a lot of journalism organizations, including Journalists for Human Rights, Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, they have been doing projects in Sierra Leone where they are doing exactly what you're suggesting, which is giving local journalists on the ground the skills to do their own reporting rather than relying on multinational corporations to send somebody who doesn't live there, who doesn't understand the context, who's not going to stay, who might be afraid to be honestly working in these parts of the world. Like that's not the voice that's needed to be heard. And I think that kind of on the ground training is really, really important. But I also think that the exchange has to be two-way. And we have to stop going to West Africa, for example, and saying that we always have something in the exchange to offer to people without taking what they have to offer for us. Because people figured out how to cover the earthquake in Sierra Leone that happened recently, where hundreds died after a mudslide. People covered that with almost no resources, and they did everything that they could to get the word out. They can teach us about the way that they used, for example, social media, the way that they even used word of mouth to communicate the latest about what was happening with relatives and family members. I think that we get dazzled in this age of digital with what digital can do, and it can do many things. But we forget that word of mouth is still the most trusted form of news in the entire world. And it's the most popular still. Because you might see something, but until your buddy down the road connects with you and says, no, that actually happened, you might not believe it. Word of mouth is still extremely important, and trust and integrity of people who have authority in the community to say what's going on is extremely important. Who is the source of that news? Because that's something that the digital era has definitely expanded upon, is saying whatever you want and passing it off as news. And now we're seeing, I think, a very clear example in the United States of a foreign government who has spent a lot of time trying to manipulate the United States' media and being extremely successful in doing it. So I don't trust either Russian media or United States mainstream media to tell me what's happening in that country. I actually have trusted people within both countries that I follow on social media and who might work for much smaller organizations, but whose work I know is reputable and who have demonstrated their reputation over time. We need that in Sierra Leone. We need to identify who those people are and augment their platform. I don't think that we need another Reuters in Sierra Leone or another. And to be quite frankly honest with you, they are cutting back all of their international bureaus as they lose money. One of the first things that happens when these organizations start losing money is they start taking people out of places around the world where they just decided, you know what, that was a luxury. So I do think that the future is investing in individuals who can build up their credibility, who can connect locally, who can use local networks. I think that that's as true in Canada as Sierra Leone, but I wanted to answer based on the context of your question. So thank you. Now, I will say that we wanted to do some more stuff.
We have time for discussions, whatever people want to do. It's 9:30.
Okay. I just wanted to, if people wanted to come back to the Black Power Hour stuff, the handouts that you were given, asking more information about the prison stuff. All right. I just, I want to do that work while we're... Plug that. Who's next? Anybody else have a comment, have a question? I'll get you next.
I have a question which kind of I was going to ask and you sort of answered it, but I want to just dive a little deeper into it, which is about this tendency of having this sort of colonial parachute of people into Africa. And we also see the same thing happening all across Canada, whether it be in Black community, Indigenous community, whatever community. You have someone who has no clue. They might live in the same city, but they've actually never been to the hood. They've never been to where we live. And then they're given the assignment to go tell a story about what's happening here. So they come out with stuff that's so messed up and misguided, but the editor also has never really talked to Black people, so they have no idea that the stuff is actually whacked. So you have all these messed up stories about us that then people continue to read and watch that is like some weird movie, but it's actually what they call news, which is strangely enough fake news. One of the few times I'll agree with Trump.
That is a huge concern. I want to talk about it more by way of a bit of a story. Anybody in this room heard of the late Rob Ford? Cool, okay, that's good. He was a thing for a little while. But I bring him up because Rob Ford's tenure as mayor had all sorts of spill-off consequences for marginalized communities. And I'm not just talking about the way that he would slander us or the programs that we relied upon that he cut, although those things did happen and they were significant. I'm also talking about Rob Ford's association in particular with the Somali community in Toronto. Because of that man, because of his affiliations with people who were suspected to be gang members, an ignorant media culture descended upon Dixon, the area where a lot of Somali immigrants moved to in Toronto. And having never been there before, having no ability to speak the language, having no understanding of the local culture, of the diasporic implications of why they are there, they all rushed into Dixon to get their stories. When I first went to Dixon, after we heard that there was a video of Rob Ford smoking drugs and that it might be somewhere in Dixon, and everybody was looking for this, and so much heat was coming down on the community, I went to do some reporting for Torontoist. The first thing that people in the community said to me when I arrived there is, "Are you from the Toronto Star?" Now, I wasn't at that time. But they asked because the Toronto Star, in breaking the scandal about Rob Ford's drug use, had used the word Somali 10 times in their original story. they kept referring to these two men who had a videotape purporting to show Rob Ford smoking drugs as being Somalis and Somalis and the Somali men and the Somalis and the Somalis. 10 times. They never explained why this was relevant to the story. But the community got the message. You're trying to say that that's who these people are. So when any journalist went to Dixon after that, they were not welcome. And I understand that instinct on the part of the community. I went and I took the beating from people anyway, and then I kept coming back. I went to a community meeting in the basement of 320 Dixon after the police came and raided it and arrested dozens of people, kicked open doors. They handcuffed a woman in her 90s, a black woman, when they did that raid. Handcuffed her behind her back. I can understand why people lost faith, and it had to be rebuilt. So I kept going back and kept going back and kept going back. And it does apply whether you're right, whether it applies in an international context or we're talking locally, this idea of kind of like parachute journalism, it does. And I want to connect it back to the previous question to say that that is actually like a business opportunity for people in that community. Because they don't need somebody to come from outside and tell their story. And in fact, that person's not going to do it justice the way that they can. But their community is longing for someone to tell the story honestly. Their community is longing for people to tell the story, maybe even in their language. Not maybe, they definitely are. And that's not being provided by the mainstream. So it's not just an opportunity in terms of being factual and being accurate and providing culturally sensitive news. It's a business opportunity. Because I started out in this writing for my own blog that I made a funny name for. And I didn't think anybody was paying attention. But I'll tell you something. When I left the Toronto Star in April, I wrote the letter saying I was leaving, and I posted it on my blog. That post was retweeted 4,500 times. Nothing I ever wrote for the Toronto Star was retweeted 4,500 times. That's what I mean when I say I took my audience with me. But I had to start from zero in order to get there, and it took 7 years. And I didn't realize all that time that that's really what I was building. But somebody in the community today who says the stories that I want, I don't see them out there being reflected, you've got to do the work. Because over time, you build that local, hyper-local audience, the 5 or 10 people who are checking on your stuff, and then maybe every now and again you get a big break and you write something that appeals to a much bigger group of people. And then you build that a little bit, and then you keep going, and you keep going, and you keep going. We can't be the Toronto Star tomorrow, and we don't need to be. We need to tell faithful stories about what's happening in our communities that resonate with that community first. If it goes beyond, great. But that's our first responsibility. Last thing I'll say about the Somali community in Toronto. I wrote a story about a horrible documentary that Vice did called This is Dixon. This was a documentary where Vice went into Dixon for like a year and a half. They spent a crazy amount of money and time to try and, in their words, discover whether or not there was a gang in Dixon. They stigmatized the entire community. They focused on guns and drugs and gangs and connections to Rob Ford. And that was the story that they wanted to tell. And after spending all that time and money and resources in the community, the last line, I shit you not, literally the last line in the Vice documentary was, after all of our searching, after all of our reporting, we were not able to determine whether or not there's a gang in this community. That's the last line of the film, and then it just ends. And you're like, oh, come on! Like, really? But I bring that up because I wrote a scathing review of that documentary for the Toronto Star. I published it, and I gave them a picture. So here's actually, I'll go back to the question that Habiba asked about how do we start doing this stuff. So one of the things I do when I know I'm writing a sensitive piece is that they usually choose images because they have these huge banks of images in places like the Toronto Star and other media organizations. But if I'm writing something that I know is truly sensitive and that they're going to probably do some foolishness with, I say, I want to choose the image. I take it out of their control. Please at least let me suggest the image that I would like to use. And if you don't want to use it, then we can have a discussion. I picked an image from the documentary that didn't show guns or anything like that. It showed 3 young black women, Somali women, laughing. When I woke up the next day to share my story on social media, that was not the image that was used. The image that was used was a photograph of the aftermath of the raid on 320 Dixon after the Rob Ford crack tape. And I contacted my editor and I said, why did you do this when I picked the image? He said, we had an issue because we were like, these young women may be minors and we don't have their permission and we're not sure if they would feel comfortable. Now, that's not usually what they do. However, I thought that there might be something honestly fair about that. This is a very controversial topic. It was not a well-received documentary. Maybe they wouldn't appreciate being the face of it for a Toronto Star column. Fair enough. So then I asked, well, then why didn't you pick something similar to that? Why did you pick a picture that actually reinforces the stereotypes that I'm smashing in this piece? And he said, if you type in Dixon into the Toronto Star's photo database, all you get are photos like these. That's what systemic racism is for me. Because nobody had to tell anyone to do that. It's just a compilation. It's the end product of years of stigmatizing a community and only sending people there when something bad happens. No individual had to take responsibility for that database because it was done unwittingly by hundreds over a very long period of time. And I raise that simply to say that, like, that's the importance of local people telling local stories. Is that if we don't allow that to happen, then we get that image of Dixon no matter what the story is. I will ramble on for one more minute just to say that next time you'll notice this now that I've said it. I'm putting this in my book. I didn't even tell. There's like a full room of people here. I didn't say one word about my book. I don't know. You guys are going to buy it when it comes out though, right? I'm writing about the idea that whenever you see a story about so-called crime, what's the image that gets used 99% of the time? No. It's an institutional image. Hey? Police, like police cars or police tape or a police officer standing looking very attentive. And I don't think people actually question what's going on there. Like, what's going on when you see this over and over and over and over and over and over again? And the idea is to remind you that when we talk about crime, the police are here to protect you. The police are not here to protect you. They're definitely not here to protect me. But that's the message that keeps being unwittingly reinforced. And it's a lack of creativity, too. So, for example, when I was talking about this issue of what happened with Dion Renee, and I was like, I can't believe that all these news agencies like had this footage of a woman being assaulted inside of a public building and that they didn't do anything with that. I started thinking about, why does this feel so like this erasure of our problem? Why does it feel so familiar? And I remembered an instance of a black woman recently who went missing. And every photo, when I Googled her name, every photo was not a photo of her. It was a photo of a police car or a police insignia or police tape. So you're looking for a woman. You're hoping that people will recognize her face and find her. And you literally don't even use that as the headline image. You use a police officer or a police car. These are the implications of this unthinking perpetuation of systemic racism, where this image of this overwhelming authority force is more important than showing you the woman who's missing, who we're trying to find. Time for one more.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for everything. I just wanted to ask, I guess, what advice do you have for folks, I had to write it down, navigating systems where we're looking to give honest opinions, we're looking to call out systems of power, especially for young people, but also feel the pressure to have to account for the feelings of white folks who are going to ask us inevitably to explain why we feel like we need to take this stance, why we feel like we need to keep talking about this stuff. Like, how do we navigate that balance? Especially like well-meaning white people who are like, you know, I really just want to help, and why do we still have to talk about this?
When somebody wittingly or unwittingly, intentionally or unintentionally, is advancing racism and is saying things that hurt you, intention no longer matters. If I step on your toe when I walk by you every day, and every day I say I didn't see your foot there, after a while when your toe is broken, it doesn't matter if I really truly didn't see you there. All that matters is the damage that I keep doing to you over and over and over again. In that light, I would say, be careful about trying to invest so much time into people who refuse to listen. Be very, very careful and vigilant and always rethinking and re-examining that in your mind. And you can do it on a case-by-case basis, but never forget that that's a part of your analysis. Because what I find happens a lot of the time is that first we say, oh, I don't think they mean to do any harm. And then we spend the next 5 hours arguing with them. And then there's nothing left for ourselves. There's nothing left for our community. Our spirit is drained. We're tired. We're frustrated. We don't feel like we've moved forward because they can walk away at any time during that 5 hours and be like, interesting, I'll think about all this. So we have to guard our energy and our spirits as this precious resource that is a finite resource. We don't have limitless spirit. We don't have limitless courage. We definitely, as people of color who are doing all this extra work, we don't have unlimited time. All those things are limited. So we do have to think about that in doing the work. And I believe, I'll give you a final example, is that the people who we're hoping are kind of close enough that they will listen, that they might change something, that they might back us and support us, they're going to be there anyway. They don't need all of this preening and this grooming and this special attention. They're going to be there because they have done the work without you. They have, I read Frantz Fanon, and I read Frantz Fanon like 3 pages at a time, and I stop. Because I'm like, this is so heavy. What the heck is this man talking about? But I go back. I don't just innately get it because I'm black. I got to do the work. Haven't we done the work? When are they going to do the work? When are they going to stop asking you to do the damn work for them every time? So that's what I would say to you, is that I don't believe in this term allies anymore. There is allyship. Allyship as in it's a verb. It's a thing that you do. I believe in that. I believe in allyship because you got to show me what you're doing. But I don't believe in allies. I don't believe of people who show up and occupy space and can't be criticized because they are calling themselves an ally. I'm not down with that. Don't worry about people who want to be allies. Worry about allyship. And when you say to people who are coming up to you with that stuff or coming up to you with the, well, why do we have to keep talking about this? Can't we get along? Shouldn't we remember the words of Dr. King? What I would encourage you to do is think of like the most radical ass shit that you have read recently and be like, I would love to have that conversation with you. But first, I want you to read this. And after you've done reading it, take some notes and think about it, and then come back to me. and we'll talk about it. And 9 out of 10 of them will never come back. But the one that does is the one you want to talk to.
Yes, just a couple of points. Number one is in doing a lot of anti-racism work, one is constantly accused of being biased. And I constantly refute that concept because to say that one is biased would suggest that there is no evidence or concrete evidence for what I am bringing forward. So first of all, I'd like to say I thank you very much, and I loved bringing these new concepts, but I really have difficulty in adopting the position that I am biased, because I am not biased. I have evidence, I have proof, and I have long-term struggle to back up what I'm saying.
Hear that.
If you want to talk about being subjective and bringing my personal experience into the conversation, that's a different issue.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm going to be bringing my personal experience and what the work that I have done into this forum. But bias, I am not. So I move from that because it's not even connected to something that's really troubling.
I'm glad you said it, though, honestly.
Really troubling for me is that we keep asking these activists who may not, I think I coined the term once, a white reporter asked me something about my activism, and I said, oh, I didn't even know I was that. I never used that terminology. I'm just trying to survive. So that too had a subjective, objective connotation. But we keep asking people to stand out in the forefront, for like Ms. Khan. And when they do that, I often bring the case of a woman a long time ago, a black teacher who was a principal, and I call it the Sandra Best case, where we were having black kids constantly, particularly black boys, being kicked out of the school system for no valid reasons. And she adopted a position that no black kid is getting kicked out of this school. And she developed a system whereby she had round tables, brought in more resources, and worked through the issues. What did it get her? She got removed from the school system as a principal. She got left out of being in inner city and in the Preston area, and they put her out in the country where her voice wouldn't be heard, and she had no black kids in her classroom. And I can honestly say you may as well say it killed her. It killed her spirit. And we never, in that light, had her agitating for change. Did we support, after we asked her, all black teachers, to do this kind of thing and stand up for our kids and rights and what have you, but when this happened to her, there was nobody to be found. We heard no voices in terms of support for her. So I'm afraid for people like Ms. Khan, who stands up, because even as part of this forum, like, there needs to be a book, what happens after the radicalism? What actions do we have to support when all of that rains down on her? And maybe she doesn't get the job, she doesn't get this or that, or she's ostracized and this kind. We're not spending time when we're asking people to take on these roles. We're doing next to nothing for the long-term picture of what it is that we want to happen, or what role we're going to play in sustaining these people that we're asking, whether it be reporters, activists, or whatever. So I think we really need to address that. Otherwise, I don't blame people. They're not going to stand out. They're going to get killed, massacred. We need to start thinking about, when it happens, what are we going to do?
For anybody who may not know, this is Lynn Jones, and Lynn is such a valued member of my community as a black person in this country. I mentioned earlier that I went to visit your archive earlier on this week, and it's a collection of decades of one person, Lynn, seeing black people in the media in Nova Scotia and taking out a pair of scissors and saving it. And you would not believe what Lynn has collected and the significance, the depth of what Lynn's been able to collect in terms of arts, in terms of sports, in terms of politics, in terms of law, race relations and all, of course, but it's us in so many facets of ourselves as black people. I really, really want everybody to go and see these archives. We want to have enough resources to make sure those archives are preserved in the right way and that as many people get to see them as possible. So I just want to say that first. But Lynn, to your very important point, and I'll be brief because I know we're probably getting close to time here. I will make this personal because I take on a lot. Actually, there's another person in this room who's like sitting in a corner sniffling right now because she's so run down from so many days of activism and driving my ass around and doing all kinds of other things in between. We do need to take care of ourselves, and we need to expand, I think, the notion of something that's very popular nowadays. It's called self-care. Meaning do it yourself care in terms of what I see. And I think it was Angela Davis who was challenging this notion recently and saying that there can't really be a self-care without a supportive community behind. And I think that to Lynn's point that this is something that we all need to explore. So I am the luckiest person in my city right now because everywhere I go, black people come give me love. Everywhere. If I'm in the grocery store, people are not shy. They do not hesitate. I was crossing the street recently, and a woman waved her left hand out of the driver's side of the car, and I stopped literally in the middle of the street to go and like say hi, and she gave me her phone number. No, not like that. No. No. As in like, no, okay. I'll stop digging the hole because she said, I saw you on the news. I'm having an issue in the community. I want to talk to you. And here's my number. And this is happening to me in the subway. You know, everywhere I go in Toronto, now that I'm a recognizable face for this movement, people come and they don't just unload all their stuff on me. Most of them say, how are you doing though? What do you need? I've been the kind of person in my life who doesn't say yes when people want to help me. But nowadays, a couple of times people who are really close to me have said, I'm going to make some food for you so you can eat. I say, okay. I'm going to make sure that you get home early from this event because otherwise I know you're going to stick around and you'll be there for 3 more hours. People are taking care of me in the community after seeing what I'm going through because it's been very public for me. But I mentioned my friend Amina here as an example when I started this talk because I know how many of us in the community are behind the one that you see. And I do think that we should do exactly what you say, Lynn. I think that we should make a guidebook or a handbook. We should start collecting stories about what it looks like to care for each other. One of the greatest inspirations of my work in the last couple of years has been Black Lives Matter, Toronto. And within Black Lives Matter is one of their co-founders, Sandy Hudson. Sandy is wise and strategic beyond most people that I know. But I love Sandy because she always talks about how we care for each other as black people. She always brings it back to caring. Talking about a policing system that doesn't provide care for somebody who's having a mental health breakdown, that approaches the situation with force and with violence, and how what we really want in those situations is care instead. That's what we deserve as black people. And I think that we should do what you're saying, Lynn. I think that we should start to collect the ways for people who are doing this work, whether it's the visible work that I'm doing or the not as visible work? What are the strategies? When somebody in our community goes down, how do we support them? When somebody needs money, what are the things that people are doing in order to raise that money so that somebody can live? You know, we heard our friends here talk tonight about how they're taking on a lot of these costs and they're fundraising. How are we making sure that they're not pulling everything out of their pocket every time? Yo, my North Preston people who came through tonight ran a beautiful community program that I went to last night out of their pocket. And there were 17 kids in a basement. Because that's love. But that's not sustainable, right? How are they doing it? Somebody should ask them before they leave tonight. I think we need to collect the stories. I think Lynn's right. And I think that that's also a way of modeling the kind of communities that we actually want instead of always talking about what we don't want. It's finding the examples of real, genuine care amongst and for Black people in our communities and saying, you can do this too. Here's how we did. So I agree, Lynn. I thank you for saying it. And I think we should practice what you're preaching. Elle?
When he was here, and then I'm like, I'm in Cape Breton, I'm just going to dump you on North Preston. Like, let me take him. So we really appreciate how much work you did when you were here to connect. You were running off your feet to make sure that you touched everybody who wanted to have a piece of you, and we really appreciate that. So thank you so much for taking so much time with us. Thank you to everybody who came in the room, and I just want to point something out, that people really give space to people of color to ask questions. Yeah. And that doesn't always happen in the room, so I want to say that, you know, for people that sat and let people of color take space in this room tonight, that was really, really important. So that was a nice feeling to see that just happen without anybody being told. So thank you all. Thank you to Kings, Solidarity Halifax, District Labor Council, CKPU, Ranchella being here so patiently, taking your time away from the station. I know it's a late night. You all want to talk to Desmond. Thank you. And Ed, you got a shout out. Atlantic Livestream. And there's so many brilliant and beautiful people in this room as well. I can't say out their names, but thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Ed edited that. So he gathered the essays. There's also poems by the woman inside. So it's primarily written by women in prison. It's also Can Let Get Away Without Shouting Out, Emma Halpern. Now with Elizabeth Fry, who is so responsible for so much.